Welcome, everybody. I hope that you really have fun in the session today. Certainly as much fun, if not more, than I've had putting it together and then also spending this time with you today. Ultimately, the purpose of what we want to focus on is to review the impact of inclusive organizational cultures, and specifically how leaders are central to promoting diversity of thought. And there's truly a lot that I want to unpack with you. That being said, keep the conversation going. Let's keep this as interactive as possible. Use that question and answer feature. We are monitoring that as if it was a live chat. So feel totally free to ask us questions there and interact with us. So I want to actually hear from you guys a little bit. Thanks to everybody who was already helping us resolve some technical issues there. But here's something that I want you to think about. If you were to focus on your personality and your working style, think about yourself in the context of work. What is something that you really like to be recognized and appreciated for in the workplace? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. I'm going to introduce myself in the interim, and then I'd like everybody who's willing to chat your answer to this question. Focusing on your personality or working style, what do you want to be recognized or appreciated for in the workplace? I'll introduce myself, and then we'll come back and we'll look at all of your responses live. So my name is Rachel, and I'm the Principal Organizational Development Consultant for the Myers-Briggs Company. I get to work with clients all over the world to really create learning and development that is impactful, transformative, and strategic. I'm certified in all of our tools and certainly others, but this particular topic is jazzing to me because I'm actually passionate about leadership development. It's where I chose to focus and publish my dissertation, specifically looking at what are the areas of leadership development that leaders find most useful. And so it's really close to my heart to be able to talk today about the vein of leadership that is becoming more and more important, called inclusive leadership. And just for those of you who are curious, I'm based out of Jupiter, Florida. If at any time my internet or something like that cuts out, definitely let us know. I'll try to hotspot it. We will mitigate it. We should all be used to this now, right? After a little bit over a year for many of us of work from home. Okay, let's get back to it. Let's see who responded to this. I asked you to consider this question and post in chat. If you focused on your personality and your work style, what's something about you that you like to be recognized and appreciated for in the workplace? So Caitlin, what are you saying?
So we have some people saying for being creative and solving problems. We have creativity, collaborating and being good on a team, ability to connect information to insights. Also, the way that I contribute to the goals of the organization was one of them. Being inclusive and working hard. Bringing career expertise and knowledge, being diligent, connecting people, and my interpersonal skills. We have quite a few coming through.
Nice, nice. I really appreciate it, guys, and keep those coming, because these are actually very germane to today's conversation, and we'll actually come back to this one more time today. So it's useful if you have your answer, go ahead and type it in. We'll come back to it one more time. So here's the agenda of what we want to cover today, kind of 5 stops on this hour. We want to start a little bit on terminology, just kind of framing the dialogue, making sure that we're all on the same page as to when I start talking about diversity and inclusion, what am I actually talking about? Then we're going to jump right into some benefits of inclusive workplaces. Then we're going to shift gears to ask, how do we create some inclusive workplaces, right? What are some of the challenges that leaders face in promoting diversity of thought, in really creating those inclusive cultures? And then we're going to end on a more practical recommendation-based note around what are 3 things you can do to start moving the needle in your organization around inclusive leadership. My hope for you is that regardless of what hat you're wearing when you come to this, you might be a direct manager who wants to better harness the diversity that you have on your team. You might be a leader of leaders who needs to train all of the leaders in your organization to be more inclusive. You have that desire, you have that passion, but you have to cascade it to your leaders. You might be someone in HR who has to actually formalize leadership development around inclusion. This presentation has something for all of you, and I'm really hoping that you'll garner some value out of it. So let's jump right in. The DE&I landscape is a pretty big landscape, right? We have huge, lofty concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And where I think talent development can really make a strong impact is in the area of inclusion. So we've been having a lot of conversations with clients, especially over the last year. And all of this work is important work, but I think in the area of inclusion is where we can really use training and development to move the needle. Really, really important. So at its baseline, inclusion and inclusive leadership is about creating a culture where diverse employees and leaders can thrive. What do we mean here by diverse employees? I want you to picture what comes to your mind when I say that. So really, diversity might be a lot bigger than we sometimes think about it. A very broad definition of it is that it could be categorically looked at least in these three different ways. We're not enabling all of our webcams right now, but if we were, we probably thought of diversity in the visual sense. The differences that you could pick up in the way I might look versus you might look, all of those visible differences and characteristics that we pick up on. The other part of diversity are those invisible differences of characteristics, things that you ascribe to or that are characteristics of you. Maybe there's a disability, maybe there's a religious preference, maybe there's your sexual preferences, mental health, etc. Then there's the aspect of diversity of thought where we're going to focus on today. And that is really that cognitive side, that part that you bring to the table in every role you have at an organization that is uniquely you. You could be one of 50 of the same exact title or role in your company, and yet you are uniquely you because of your diversity of thought. Let's zoom into that just a little bit, and there's a very intentional use here of this visual with the iceberg. So the diversity of thought, really the way I see it, is the fact that people differ one from another. That's how we create distinction or difference. One of the ways we do it is we have very different thinking styles. Our perception is different. Our way of seeing is different. Your experience is different than mine. My background is unique to me. Yours is unique to you. Then there's things like personality type. And all of the aspects of us that influences, the way we like to recharge our battery, the way we like to address our communication, how people might describe us. And then there's things like our values. All of these things, if you look at them in the placement of the iceberg, one of the things that's challenging about diversity of thought is that these differences are at times harder to see. Even if you picture somebody applying for a job, it's not often that the resume will speak to these kinds of things. Even interview questions are not always designed to bring these things out. They tend to focus more on tangible factors, right? Not the intangibles. Those things are just harder to get to. So I want us to bring to life what this concept looks like, and I want to do it through a focus on an example of personality type. And we're going to use the Myers-Briggs personality type for that. So in order to do it, I want to launch a very quick poll. I just want to know, everybody who's on the call, how much do you know about the MBTI? Caitlin, can you launch that brief poll for us now, please?
Yes, it is launched. Just going to give it a couple more seconds.
Great. Thanks to everybody who's already participating. Michelle, thanks for that note as well in the chat.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and then I will share the results.
Great. Let's see what folks had to say. What are you seeing, Caitlin?
So we have 14% of people are MBTI practitioners and use it often. 12% are MBTI practitioners but do not use it often. 40% have received feedback but have not been certified. 23% have heard of the MBTI but have not completed it, and 11% have said, "What is the MBTI?"
Okay, very nice. That's actually super helpful, everybody. I am going to give you a very brief example of the Myers-Briggs. So I like knowing that it looks like half or more of you will sort of know what we're looking at. And those of you who don't, it's okay. I'll kind of walk you through, and I promise that's really going to be the only time we're going to look at the Myers-Briggs during this session. So you don't need to have a working knowledge of it for this session to be useful to you. So hearken back for a moment. A little bit ago, I asked you to type in chat, what's something that you want to be recognized for? Now, if I ask that question in the middle of a team building or leadership development exercise that I was doing around the MBTI, one of the things that I know as a practitioner is that personality would come to bear. It would come to expression during this workshop. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. Somebody on that team might answer that question with saying, you know what I want to be recognized and appreciated for? The fact that I have preferences for N and T. And so they might say something like, I want to be appreciated for the fact that I'm a systems builder. I like project execution. I'm good at implementation. I want to be recognized for my competence. This is why we call our NT folks, right, possibilities for systems people. Somebody with the middle two letters of their MBTI type being S and T, they might say something totally different. We call these folks our bottom line folks, and they might say something like, I want to be recognized as the team's bottom liner. I want to be appreciated for the fact that regardless of where the team is, where it goes, all the brainstorm that it's doing, I keep things grounded. I keep things data driven. Data is very important for us and for our success as a team. Somebody with sensing and feeling preferences, that SF in their letters, they might have a totally different answer. They might say, I want to be recognized for the fact that I connect on a very practical level with what people need, what the customer needs, what our stakeholders need. And I want to be valued for the fact that I provide that practical support for others. And yet still somebody with an NF preference in their type might say something like, you know, I want to be recognized for the fact that I came to work for this company because I believe in its values. I believe in its vision. Its values matches my values. And I want to be recognized for the fact that in my work, in the decisions that I make, I'm staying true to those values. I want to be recognized for that. And you know what's interesting is, and I realize you may not have as much knowledge of the MBTI, and that's totally okay. What we're doing right now is we're just showing the fact that a very simple question, like what do you want to be recognized for in the workplace, I might make the assumption as a team manager that the way I want to be recognized or what I want to be recognized for is what everybody on my team wants to be recognized for, right? That sort of golden rule type of thing. The other mistake that I might make as a team leader is to think that the answer is a one size fits all. Well, obviously, you know, people want to be recognized for completing their job on time, or getting the job done, you know, period, staying within time, scope, budget, whatever that might be. I might make some pretty big assumptions that way, and in doing so, I might miss some of the invisible but really critical differences that exist within people. And what's interesting about this isn't just a nice to know sometimes about people. Sometimes this deeply connects to what people are motivated by, how they're engaged at work, how they might be at their best at work. Sometimes people really want that recognition beyond just the tasks that they get done for work. They want to be recognized for the unique approach that they take to getting that task done. So one more question for you in chat. Harken back to what you told us was important for you, what you wanted to be recognized for. What happens when you're in a job, you're in a workplace, where that thing that you told us was important to be recognized for, it's not valued. That thing that you told us about, it's just not valued in how you do your job, in what you bring to the table. Tell us in chat, what does that do for you specifically? Elizabeth, I love that. I think you said it so beautifully. I feel out of place. Terry nailed it. I'm disengaged. I'm likely to leave. Terry, I love that because it's so true. It demotivates me. Jim, I love your sort of action-oriented approach that you would work around it. Most of us are still connecting with the emotion that it would make us actually feel out of place or burned out. Some people are even saying, I love the way Erica said, it would make me want to retreat away from the task. Like it almost feels like, why am I doing this task then if the way that I would bring about this task doesn't really make a difference? And Hazel, it's okay that you don't see the chat because we have it as a question and answer function where we get to see the chat. I'm sorry about that. For some reason, the chat function is not public in GoTo training. So thanks for bringing that up. Somebody else said, I'd have a really hard time focusing and I would feel defeated. Well, you guys aren't alone. We're not alone in that. If you would feel negative effects, so do other people. In fact, the research is showing that when that happens, when the thing that you want to be recognized and appreciated for isn't in your workplace, you're 3 times more likely to seek employment elsewhere. Isn't that a powerful statistic? We talk a lot about employee retention, hiring and retaining the best talent. We make huge investments into people, and sometimes we miss something like this. If the person doesn't feel recognized beyond the fact that they accomplished the work, if they don't feel recognized for what they uniquely bring to the table, there's some pretty detrimental effects. So for the sake of today and the rest of the presentation, when I talk about inclusion, I'm talking specifically about the type of inclusion that gives voice to that diversity of thought, to those things that you and I want to be recognized for our work. And therefore, when I say that a team or an organization is inclusive, I'm actually setting a pretty high bar. I'm not just saying they're open to diversity or they're tolerant of diversity. I'm saying an inclusive organization is one that is committed to creating an environment where the members feel inspired and encouraged to bring to their workplace their uniqueness of diversity of thought. That's a really high bar. But here's what happens when you meet it. So what are some of the benefits that employees who do have inclusive workplaces actually enjoy? Here's a couple of them. Some business outcomes proven in the research are they see 70% higher growth and more likelihood to capture new markets. That means employees are bringing to light ideas that are helping them create new products or services, that are helping the company fundamentally grow more than it would have without that diversity of thought. 36% higher profitability, 87% better decisions. We have a lot of webinars and content around homogeneous and heterogeneous teams, and the fact that if you have a like-minded team, it might feel easier to work on that team, but the proof is in the pudding that diverse teams are the teams that have better decision making. Also, 19% better innovation. I don't know about you, but I'd be happy with any one of these 4 things being brought about on my team, but all of these and all of them as a needle being moved from inclusion is very, very powerful. Just as a quick reminder, you are going to get these slides and the resources are cited right under them. So don't worry about, frantically taking notes about a resource. Here are some people outcomes too. So if I work for an inclusive organization, how do I describe that? How do I describe that feeling that it generates? People say that they feel that they're treated respectfully and fairly, that they belong, that they're valued. Here's the crux, that they're confident and inspired to contribute and share their perspective. What that means is, tangibly speaking, in team meetings, during different jobs and tasks that you're accomplishing, this leads to employees feeling like they can speak up more, they can contribute more, their organizational citizenship goes up, they feel psychologically safe enough to challenge the status quo of what's happening at the company, to bring up a divergent perspective or a divergent idea, and to help inform our decision making through the unique vantage point of the way they see things. Again, this is a really high bar. This is making me feel valued and recognized, not just because at the end of the day I accomplished my job description, but because of what I uniquely bring to the table. Now, is this a nice to have or a need to have? You tell me. Happy to see your answers in chat. Happy for you to treat that as a rhetorical question, whatever you'd like. But I will share with you that there's something that's happening in the workplace right now that I would say rises to the point of urgency. I don't know how much you're following the literature, but there's a current crisis that's happening in the job market where it's actually being dubbed names around the greatest disengagement, a new name that just came out, the Great Resignation, where a record number of employees are actually leaving their jobs to go find employment elsewhere. And I see a very clear connection between this and between inclusive workplaces. And I went out to look for some research and found that it actually indeed is true. So for example, a research scientist who crunched some data with SurveyMonkey found out fundamentally workers who are satisfied with the way their company addresses DE&I issues, guess what? They're happier with their jobs. Here's another one. Nearly 80% of employees agree that they want to work for a company that values diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are pretty powerful statistics. And to me, I feel like in the last 20 or so years of looking at the corporate space, I feel like we're really seeing a transition where it used to be that most companies would really fight for talent and talent retention and hiring really, really good people through a lot of tangible factors, right? Pay, location, benefits. I'm starting to see a pretty pronounced shift here to some intangible factors. And that's a change that some of us may be less ready for than others of us. So I would say, like many of you have said to us in chat, it's a need to have. It's a need to have because we have to position ourselves for the reality of what's coming in the future, where these intangibles are becoming increasingly more important. And with a remote workforce that has more choices than they've ever had before, that's really important too. But here's the problem. I think most of us have agreed to this point. Yes, Rachel, all of this stuff is important. But you know what the challenge is that inclusive workplaces do not happen automatically. It doesn't happen by itself. In fact, when it comes to creating inclusive workplaces, the very first thing we need to do is what we just did. We need to broaden our definition of diversity to make sure that we're not pigeonholing diversity to just one aspect of it, but that we're broadening our definition to understand all that it can mean, which is why we've been talking specifically about the vein of diversity called diversity of thought. But then it also begins with realizing that diversity alone is not enough. And this is actually proven in the research. There was a 2020 Harvard Business Review study that came out and said, you know what, throwing a mix of people together, so hiring for diversity, forming diverse teams, guess what? That did not directly lead to any of the benefits of diversity that we just looked at. Those statistics, those wonderful inclusive workplace outcomes, you don't get there through diversity alone. In fact, inclusion is the lever. If you want to get at these things, if you want to be able to create environments in the workplace where people feel like they can speak up and they can contribute and they feel inspired to bring their whole selves to work and to share about all of these under the iceberg things, right? These difficult things to understand, then you have to create the type of inclusive workplace that creates the psychological safety for it. Inclusive workplaces really put diversity of thought front and center. And yes, I like Wanda made a comment about, you know, our millennials starting to demand this more and more. I think we could have an entire conversation about some of the shifts in the workplace that millennials are bringing, but we're definitely seeing that increased need for the intangible things of a job, not just the tangible. Now, in order to get to inclusion though, and this is where we're going to make a pretty hard shift, we need to turn our attention to leaders. Every employee in the organization is important because obviously we all interact with different employees, but the leader makes a huge impact, and that's what the research is showing us. So a study by the Harvard Business Review found out that inclusive leadership is a capability where leaders learn how to leverage diverse thinking, diverse personalities, diverse ways of working, ideas and values. Notice that it's a capability. It's something that needs to be acquired, something that needs to be developed. A recent Korn Ferry study is beginning to increasingly regard inclusive leadership as the 21st century critical leadership skill, which I think is a really nice sort of way for us to begin to make this shift to say, if we want to move the needle at our company, at our organization, we cannot overlook the critical role of every single leader. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So in part, this is critical because it's actually leaders who are central to diversity of thought, not mission or vision statements. A vision statement or a mission statement is not what cascades down the organization to give legs to an inclusive initiative. If you're wanting to create an inclusive environment for your team, then you have to start with leaders. And guess why? Because it's the managers and those front leaders, the people that people report to, that have the most direct influence on the day-to-day experience of employees. They are the most immediate role models for most employees, and they have a huge amount of power to take something like an initiative of any kind, be it inclusion or be it something else, and they can implement it, they can ignore it, or they can actively undermine it. And I come across this all the time with clients that I work with. I come across the fact that there are pockets of engagement where some leaders are on board, some leaders are not so sure, some leaders are completely opposed because maybe they haven't understood the value or how to connect the dots or why this is an effective and a useful use of their time. Another reason why leaders are critical then is because they will make or break the commitments that your organization makes to inclusion. So if you're a leader of leaders, if you're an HR practitioner and you have to do leadership development across an organization, keep this in mind. The impact of the direct manager becomes crystallized when they are not in sync with what is a strategic priority for the organization. Let's take a look. Employees who work under a less than committed direct manager, quote, are far less likely to feel welcome and included, 2 times more likely to feel excluded at work, and they are 3 times more likely to look for a job elsewhere, looking for a company with consistent leadership engagement around DE&I. I don't know how much you follow the news, but it makes me think of Sony being in the news recently about the individual experience of an employee and how that is disconnected, according to the employee, disconnected from the way Sony wants Sony to be portrayed with DE&I, the vision that they want to have. And that disconnect between what the organization is strategically prioritizing and what the employee is facing every single day is what makes or breaks commitments to inclusion. I'm pausing for just a second. I'm checking the chat just to make sure there haven't been any big questions so far. Thank you, Eric. I love that you have loved some of the questions about need to have, nice to have. I think it's great. I also love how, Elizabeth, you shared when I asked the question, is it a need to have, nice to have? You said, hey, you know what? It's both. It's a business imperative, but it's also the right thing to do. I want to tweet that and give you credit for it, Elizabeth. That's a lovely way of putting it. So let's kind of recap where we are. We know that inclusion matters. We know that diversity alone is not enough. We know that leaders are central, but then we also have this sense that not all leaders are inclusive, are they? And probably not even when they want to be. And I'll submit to you the fact that being an inclusive leader is harder than we might actually recognize which is why I wanted to show you 5 challenges, real challenges that leaders face. And I want to build our awareness around these, because if you're going to set out to be a more inclusive leader, you're probably going to face these challenges in your journey. Or if you're training leaders, if you're a leader of leaders, your leaders are facing these things, whether they're articulating them or actually not. Thank you, Erica. I love that comment. I love that this is being very helpful for you. Challenge number 1, let's look inward. Predispositions and blind spots. This first challenge is the reality that every single one of us, including leaders, of course, have a series of implicit associations and biases that have been formed by our experiences, our environments, and our personality. And these things, they actually shape our work dynamics in ways that we may not even recognize. These can be conscious or they can be unconscious, and regardless of whether they're conscious or not, they're leading in some cases to exclusion, the exclusion of others or exclusionary behaviors. Let's look at some examples. So you might be making some assumptions about what people need. That's what this photo is about. Does everybody remember about 15 or so years ago, every organization wanted to move to open workspaces? They wanted to knock down every wall, and they wanted to give people just a little, right, a desk and a computer station, and everything was going to be open. And what was the reason for it? Because they thought it would build collaboration. They thought it would create an environment where people would openly and freely share ideas. And what this did is it made a very big assumption. It made the big assumption that it would come, that first of all, that would happen, which research ended up finding was not 100% the case. And the other thing that it did is it assumed that the people who excel in that type of work environment would mean that everyone would excel in that type of work environment. And raise your hand, type in chat if you're anything like me, where if you had to work in an open environment every single day, you're pretty confident that you would not be able to bring your best self to work. I had to work in an environment like this for a brief period of time, and I remember one time I actually counted the number of times that my head looked up to watch the people that were walking by. And in the next one-on-one with a manager, I told him, did you know that I raised my head over 100 times today and became distracted 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes every time as I watched people go microwave their soup, grab a coffee, throw something away, right? All of these different things. And it was really difficult for my manager to understand it at the time. But what was happening was he was favoring something that worked really well for him. And he was making the assumption that that would work well for others. Another example of this is you might have personality preferences that you're not aware of, and that leads you to create project teams or to sort of go to a certain go-to person on your team because you know that the way that you communicate with that person is really solid. They get you, they give you the type of information that you need, you have similar communication styles, similar ways of working, and in doing so though, you can begin to favor that ease of working, and you can actually begin to exclude those people that would bring about some difference and some divergence, right? This is where the old adage comes in. If you want to just hire and work with people that are just like you, do everything the same, right? Don't change anything at all. The good news is that these biases are actually malleable, but we have to own this reality. We're not starting from a place of zero. We're actually starting from a place of bias, associations, and assumptions. Another challenge that leaders face is that diversity of thought is not easy. We don't walk around wearing diversity of thought on our sleeve. That's why I'm using the iceberg example with you, because think about some of the people that you've worked with at work for years, and you might not be able to tell me much about these things about them. I know people that I've worked with for a very long time, and a lot of our interaction has maybe been transactional. and I wouldn't be able to really say what deeply motivates them. What are some of their core values? What is a unique way that they look at the world versus the way I look at the world? And so imagine as a leader having to connect with this about each of your employees. You would need a mechanism for being able to do that. If we zero in, for example, just on personality alone, the Myers-Briggs in your 4-letter type says a lot about you. It says things like what you want to be recognized and appreciated for, how you like to communicate or not communicate. It says things like what stresses you versus what stresses me and how I might react and change. Let me give you one practical example here. I've seen where organizations have released change initiatives, and they come to us and they say, we need help because we have a group of people who's being extremely resistant. And once you actually get in there and you talk to some of the people about why they're being resistant, what you end up discovering is that they themselves didn't even realize how the change was actually either not providing them their needs during times of change, or it was stepping on a value that they had, but they were even sort of unaware of how to articulate that. They were unaware of how to articulate it to their leaders, articulate it to colleagues, or they were unaware of how to ask for what they need, how to be able to raise your hand and say, in order for me to truly buy into something, I need the A, B, C, and D. Maybe you need the Y. Maybe you need to be part of the change. Maybe you need to be getting everybody's voice involved. Whatever it is that motivates you specifically, you see the breadth of this and the depth of it. We can't possibly expect leaders to understand this for every team member without real tools and real mechanisms for being able to do that. That's why Patrick Lencioni said, start building trust on your team and start with something like a Myers-Briggs workshop, because it's going to humanize people. It's going to make you better understand the people that you're actually working with. And you should do those things on a regular basis, right? Because it's about getting to know the person. Here's another challenge. Challenge number 3 is that inclusive leadership isn't just an attitude or a desire. I don't wake up today saying, I want to be an inclusive leader and poof, automatically I am one. It's actually a set of skills and behaviors that have to be demonstrably practiced. And the challenge is, even though that's the case, only 1 in 3 organizations, guys, in 2021, like right now, only 1 in 3 organizations have a plan for developing for the inclusive development of their leaders. And there's still research that has been calling about this, and it hasn't been solved. When you look at leadership development programs from cover to cover, they don't often include explicitly or in any kind of clear thread line how to advance diversity of thought, how to train a leader to harness the diversity that's on their team, how to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion for the sake of those outcomes that it makes people feel engaged, encouraged, inspired, valued, right? For all of those really great reasons. And what these stats tell me is that we are either making the assumption that a leader just knows how to be inclusive. Oh, maybe they've been a leader for 10 years, so they know how to do this thing. Maybe not, right? Or we're saying that this is important, but we're not helping people connect the dots, and we're not giving that organizational vision legs. Here's another challenge. This one, again, we're going to turn inward, but if you're a training and development professional, you're going to say, yes, this makes so much sense. One of the challenges with inclusive leadership, and really this applies to any type of skill, but we're talking about it right now for inclusive leadership, is the area of how do I see myself as a leader versus how do the people around me see me? Because remember, if you're a leader, it's not about whether you agree that inclusion is important. It's not about whether you believe it's important. It's about whether you are creating in your direct reports and your teams and your organizations that feeling of inclusion. Are you moving the needle enough that they feel a sense of belonging, a sense of being valued, a sense of being recognized? And here's where self-perception matters. 2 out of 3 leaders hold an inaccurate view of their own inclusive leadership capabilities. 1/3 of leaders think they are more inclusive than the people around them would describe them. And then another third of leaders say, you know what? I lack confidence in my ability to be an inclusive leader, so I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to challenge the status quo. I'm not going to actively manage my biases. I'm not going to seek for ways to harness the collective diversity of my team because I don't know how. I don't have the confidence to do it. As a training and development person, it's stats like this that jazz me because it's ways that we can move the needle. If somebody perceives themselves differently than another person, we can do something about that. There's 360 tools, there's self-development tools, there's workshops we can do. If somebody holds an entirely inaccurate view of their own capabilities, we can develop tools to support that, right? So that this is both sobering news in a way, and it's good news in a way that it's actionable, that it's pointing out a problem that we can actually work on. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. The fifth challenge that I want to share with you is, let's not forget, leaders don't operate in a vacuum. Leaders operate within a certain organizational context. And oftentimes that context has processes and systems and reward structures, quiet or explicit, and it has a culture that the leader has to operate within. And in my experience, sometimes the organizational processes are outright not designed to support inclusion, or they are designed in a way that all but guarantees exclusion. Let me give you just a couple of examples. I hear organizations say all the time, train my team, I want them to be more efficient. I want them to make quick, rapid decisions. I want to create internal competition so that the best ideas can come forward. Here's the challenge with some of those constructs. Most organizations would agree that they want that, but these are all constructs that if they're not done well, they can actually lead to exclusion. So for example, if you want to make a quick decision, make it by yourself. If you want to get those 87% statistics of better decisions, then you have to have diversity of perspective. And diversity of perspective requires time, which is directly opposed to efficiency. Now, if you work with a team and a leader over time, you can learn to get both. You can build trust, you can give them tools to actually leverage the diversity on their team, and then they become faster, better decision makers at the same time, but that's not automatic. So these are all issues that our leaders have to face. And I think you would realize, like in some cases, they almost seem well beyond the leader themselves to be able to do this on their own, to be able to solve these on their own. Okay, so let's get really practical now. I want to give you some really good recommendations, some ways that you can move the needle. Some of these you may have intuited already from what I've shared so far. Some of it, may be kind of new, but here's a couple of things that you can really start to consider, regardless of where you sit in your organization. The very first thing you should have heard today is all leaders must be inclusive leaders. I often work with companies where the majority of the leadership development dollars go to the top level leaders. And I get that. I understand that budget, right, can't always stretch all the time, but let's understand also that those top level leaders, when it comes to an inclusion or an inclusive workplace, what they tend to do is they sort of cast the vision. They sort of set the tone, and then they're supposed to develop a support structure for the entire organization. But as we learned today, it's that direct manager, that frontline leader that will directly stand in the way or give legs to what you just said was important. Remember, we said that. There's actually a study that says 70% of the difference between whether you feel included or not at work is because of your direct manager. 70%. That's a huge number. So if we're only focusing up here, we're not really going to be able to give legs, and we're making some pretty big assumptions and taking some pretty big risks that top level vision is going to translate into employee daily reality. The second recommendation that I would give you is to formalize inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership can indeed be developed. There's studies that have looked at it. It's the formulation of things like associations, biases, assumptions, and we can develop learning protocols and learning workshops that consistently increase self-awareness, increase exposure to others and differences in others to the degree that it begins to expand one's thinking. And we begin to develop the ability to unlearn certain associations, certain biases, or to begin to actively manage them. We can't ever get rid of our biases completely, right? That would be, we're meaning makers as humans, but we can actively engage in the process of managing those biases, especially when they're inadvertently leading to exclusion. So here's one example. At the Myers-Briggs Company, one of the things that we do with inclusive leadership is we target the specific skills that we know move the needle. So for years, we have spent years and decades helping people understand diversity of personality type and how to create a diverse leadership bench, how to create diverse teams. And what we've done is we've figured out these are the skills that you need to develop in somebody to help them become self-aware, aware of others, and be able to flex to the needs of others. Things like openness, being open to divergent ideas, courage, being willing to challenge the status quo, self-awareness, man, that's a big one. Let's talk about that in just a moment. So you might want to think about that too. If you're formalizing an inclusive leadership program, create the competencies that are going to matter to you, map content to those competencies, map reward systems to those competencies, help your leaders turn these competencies into practical, everyday behaviors. So I said we were going to talk about self-awareness. That's recommendation number 3, and it couldn't be more critical. So I'll give you a very simple model that I use. I think anytime you're going to design a staff or a leadership development, whether it's for leaders or for staff, you have to be able to help participants answer some pretty poignant questions. This comes from adult learning, right? As adults, we have certain expectations around learning. When it comes to being a more inclusive leader, I think we should answer fundamentally these questions. We should help participants get to these answers. We can't give them these answers. We create the experience that helps them get to these answers. So if I'm in an inclusive leadership program, I should be able to walk out with, what are my strengths? What are my challenges? And what do I prioritize for my own development? Because we can't boil the ocean, right? If they walk away with 8 competencies that they need to work on, human nature tells me, and our own experience tells me, they'll end up working on none. There needs to be a prioritization there. Let's talk a little bit more about what that might look like. So we cannot build programs in a one-size-fits-all approach. And we also can't build programs in a way that isn't personalized, meaning you might develop a program that ends up being rolled out to hundreds of leaders, but built into the design of that program has to be a way for people to be self-aware about themselves in relation to that skill. Because people don't just want to work on 8 competencies or 20 competencies for the sake of working on them. They want to know, where am I already seeing strengths? Where do I need to improve myself? And so what people want is they want individualized diving off points. They want to be able to say, acknowledge what I already know, acknowledge what I already do well, help me figure out ways of finding what my vulnerabilities and biases and blind spots are, and then help me self-evaluate. And I'm going to give you a little snippet of a self-evaluation in just a moment. And I'll only add here, a self-evaluation is really an important piece of a leadership program that you could begin to use today. You could develop one yourself. You could, I'm hoping that you have lots of self-evaluation opportunities in the way you develop your leaders. Another thing that you need to do too is bolster that with assessments that will tell you things about you or about your leader that you wouldn't be able to know through self-eval. Remember that challenge where leaders self-evaluate higher or better than they are seen by other people? That's why you need to use other assessments too, so that you can get a better rounded idea. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I'm going to show you 7 sample items These are excerpts of the inclusive leadership tool that we use to create for self-evaluation of your inclusive leadership quotient. And you're going to look at the item and we're going to simplify it rather than using a complex Likert scale right now. You're just going to say, is it a strength or is it a stretch? So go ahead and take a look at these and just kind of look for yourself. I'll give you a moment of quiet and write down for yourself, is it a strength? Is it a stretch? It's okay if you don't get through all of them. And if you feel like sharing some of that in chat, certainly feel free to do so. It's not required. So hopefully what you're beginning to do is you're beginning to do something like this. You're beginning to say, okay, if I truly consider this item, and I also remember how I'm perceived by others, is this a strength for me? Is it a stretch for me? Maybe some of you said not sure, right? On an item or two, I would need to ask close people around me that I trust in. The reason I'm showing you this is because self-eval is critical. Imagine, thank you, Donna, for your comment. Imagine if I specifically just said, hey, Donna, are you an inclusive leader, yes or no? How much more powerful is it for me to disaggregate what an inclusive leader is into actual items that you can then contemplate, reflect on, you can think about it in the context of work, and you can say, you know what, I think I'm really good at this, but I think this is a stretch. I think this over here, I may not have ever even had a chance to do this. This wasn't even on my radar. I heard this recently from a leader who said, I really felt like a lot of these things were stretched, but man, was it a sobering thought when I realized I do not actively manage my vulnerabilities, my biases, my assumptions. I just kind of know I have them, right? So hopefully you're finding some value in this, even though it's a snippet. And what we do in the program is we then map it to the competency that it correlates to. And it's one of those 8 competencies that I showed you earlier. You don't have to use these competencies. You can make competencies that are uniquely yours for your organization. But what it does is it gives unique starting points. It gives adults the ability to say, what's my diving off point? What are my strengths? What are my stretches? And therefore you get to personalize the learning experience in a scalable sort of way, right? Without having to personalize the experience on a one-to-one. And by the way, self-eval is great, whether you do coaching, mentoring, multi-month virtual workshops like we do, whichever modality will work. Okay, so we want to put some resources in your hand that are going to be very helpful. I want to quickly summarize with saying, these are some of the things that I think were most important for today, that there are truly good outcomes out of inclusive workplaces, but diversity alone is not enough. It's inclusion is the lever that we have to use, but we can't assume that it's a given. Even if a leader wants it, even if they believe that inclusion is important, that diversity is important, there are challenges that they face where they need help to be able to become more inclusive leaders. Not that they're not inclusive today, but to grow in inclusive leadership. And the good news is, of course, that inclusive leadership can indeed be developed because it's about demonstrable skills like the ones we looked at. And I made the recommendation to you to leverage self-awareness, leverage self-eval tools, and to really come up with a formal plan. Don't be afraid to formalize the answer. How are we going to equip all of our people managers to become more inclusive leaders? And of course, I'm hoping that it goes without saying here to leverage today's recommendations, maybe other things that you're reading about, but to reach out too if you need a partner to support you. Caitlin, can you please tell us about some resources we're making available? Thank you, Erica. I'm so glad that this has been helpful so far.
Awesome. Yes, I can. So we have this page on the screen right now. We'll be sending this link out as well, so don't worry about trying to copy it down. But we have a page dedicated to our diversity and inclusion resources, and we have blogs, research, some other things on there. We're going to post this webinar on this page as well, so that if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with others, you know where to go. And Rachel has written a short guide called The Inclusion Delusion, and that highlights some of the main points that leaders might need to think about to set up successful strategies. So that is also available on this page to be downloaded. And another thing that we have to talk about is a expert-led workshop that is set up that Rachel was instrumental in setting up. And so you can run this with any team, your leadership team, and it's split into several sessions, and you will come away with your MBTI personality preference and what it means for individuals and on teams. And then you will go more into other things with practical tips on becoming a truly inclusive leader, as well as some of the self-evaluation and action planning that Rachel was talking about. So I think we have time for one question, maybe two questions. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them right now. We will be reviewing them and emailing people back with answers directly, but I did have one or two come through already that I'd like to ask you, Rachel, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. What are you seeing?
Okay, great. So we had one that said, it sounds like leaders should understand that certain staff may have the right skills for a project, even though I, as a leader, may not communicate well with them. How do we resolve for the success for the project?
Oh, that's interesting. So I will say there's a philosophical answer and a practical answer there. In a nutshell, philosophically, we never want to pigeonhole somebody into saying you can or cannot do a project, right? You have the skills or you don't have the skills. We've all been there, done that, when if we want something and we're motivated for it, we will teach ourselves, we will learn, we will figure out a way to do it, right? So we don't want to pigeonhole people, but the practical answer to that is the leader needs to get closer to, are they giving the direct report what the direct report needs to be able to thrive? Some people want more autonomy, less direction. Some people want more direction, more structure. Give me the specific A, B, C, D that you expect from me. These are actually constructs that we cover during MBTI workshops specifically because if you don't get what you need, it could be pretty demotivating, which is why we've had leaders before who say, somebody told me in my 360, I'm the best boss they've ever had. And somebody else told me in my 360, I'm the worst boss they've ever had. However, did I manage that? Right? And that's because it says more about what the person needed than it says about the leader.
Awesome. And then just really quickly, one more. How do you deal with a leader who is unconsciously biased?
Well, what you do in a simple answer there, Simon, is you invite them into a self-awareness process where it feels okay to realize that there are biases and you expose them to those biases. So in a personality-based workshop, I might specifically help you figure out what is your four-letter type, and then I'll show you how you're motivated. And another way of saying you're motivated for this is you may overlook these other things. And so we introduce bias in a way of like what you might overdo or what you might overlook, realizing we all have them, right? And it's okay to have these. And then each progressive workshop becomes a little bit more intervention-y, right? Where we get to do a little bit more of exposing you more to those biases, to those associations and assumptions, making you feel comfortable along the way that you can do something about it, right? It's not just a, oh my gosh, I have a bias, right? That's the end of it. Really good question, Simon.
Awesome. Well, that brings us right up to time. So thank you, everyone. I know there are more questions being submitted, so we will be going through them. Rachel will take a look at them and answer them directly. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody. So good to have you.